This is absolute madness, Ambassador. Why should you build such a thing?
There were those of us who fought against it, but in the end we could not keep up with the expense involved in the arms race, the space race, and the peace race.
Before we dive in, this isn't just a movie trivia video. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of the most dangerously brilliant films ever made. Dr. Strangelove didn't just mock nuclear war, it nearly triggered a real government investigation. Stick with us, because fact number 1 alone is worth the next 20 minutes of your life. Number 1, the Pentagon thought it was a security breach. When Dr. Strangelove was released in January 1964, officials at the Pentagon were not amused. They were alarmed. Stanley Kubrick had done his research so thoroughly, reading classified military strategy documents, studying nuclear war protocols, interviewing defense experts, that senior officials genuinely suspected he had somehow obtained classified information. The film's depiction of the two-man rule for launching nuclear weapons, the breakdowns in chain-of-command communication, and the specifics of how a rogue general might actually circumvent military safeguards were uncomfortably accurate. According to author Fred Kaplan, who wrote The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, some Pentagon insiders believed Kubrick must have had an insider source. He didn't. He had simply read everything that was publicly available, and then connected dots that the military establishment wished no one had connected. The film was so precise in its absurdity that reality and satire had become indistinguishable. Number 2, it started life as a completely serious thriller. Most people don't know that Dr. Strangelove was never supposed to be a comedy, not even close. Kubrick acquired the rights to Peter George's 1958 novel Red Alert, a dead-serious thriller about an accidental nuclear war, with every intention of making a straightforward dramatic film. He hired Peter George himself to write the screenplay. He consulted with nuclear strategists. He built a realistic war room set. And then something happened that Kubrick later described as a kind of creative crisis. He kept finding that the most logical, realistic scenarios he was writing were funny. Darkly, horribly funny. As Kubrick put it in interviews, every time he tried to write a scene where a general was arguing to launch nuclear weapons, the earnestness of the character's logic made the situation absurd. He realized that the most honest way to portray nuclear deterrence strategy wasn't drama. It was satire. The comedy wasn't added to the story. The story revealed that it had been a dark comedy all along. Number 3, Peter Sellers was paid more than every other actor combined. Peter Sellers received a salary of $1 million for Dr. Strangelove. That was in 1963 dollars. To put that in perspective, the entire production budget of the film was around $1.8 million, meaning Sellers alone accounted for well over half the money Kubrick had to work with. Columbia Pictures agreed to it because they had a condition of their own. They wouldn't greenlight the film unless a major star was attached. Kubrick wanted Sellers. Columbia wanted a guarantee. The solution was simple. Pay Sellers whatever it took and build the rest of the budget around whatever was left. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Sellers delivered one of the most celebrated performances in cinema history, and technically delivered 3 of them simultaneously, since he was originally contracted to play 4 roles. The film cost relatively little outside of Sellers, and it went on to gross many times its budget. Number 4, Sellers was supposed to play 4 roles. Peter Sellers was originally cast to play 4 roles: Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, President Merkin Muffley, Dr. Strangelove himself, and Major T.J. King Kong, the Texas bomb-riding cowboy ultimately played by Slim Pickens. Sellers had been working on the Kong character with Kubrick, developing a thick Texan drawl and a swaggering energy that was entirely different from his other performances. But during filming, Sellers twisted his ankle getting out of the B-52 cockpit set. The injury wasn't severe, but it was enough to make it physically difficult to continue with a 4th demanding role. Kubrick turned to Slim Pickens, a real-life rodeo cowboy and character actor who had never seen anything like the Kubrick production in his life. Pickens allegedly didn't realize the film was a comedy. He played Kong with absolute sincerity, which is of course exactly why the performance works so perfectly. The famous bomb-riding finale was Slim Pickens being Slim Pickens. No irony required. Number 5, the war room set was pure invention and became reality. Ken Adam, the production designer who created the iconic circular war room set for Dr. Strangelove, built something that had never existed. The vast underground chamber with its single enormous round table, its ring of overhead lighting, and its vast map displays was entirely a product of his imagination. Informed by research but fabricated from scratch, The set cost a significant portion of the film's budget and was considered extravagant at the time. But it became one of the most imitated sets in film history. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he reportedly asked to see the war room upon arriving at the White House for the first time. Aides had to explain to him that no such room existed. Ken Adam later designed similarly dramatic spaces for multiple James Bond films, but he always considered the Strangelove war room his masterpiece. It influenced everything from real military briefing room aesthetics to countless films and television productions for decades afterward. Number 6. The military consultant had no idea it was a comedy. Kubrick hired a real Royal Air Force officer. Group Captain Lionel Mandrake was, in fact, a nod to the real advisors Kubrick consulted, to help make the military procedures and aircraft details as accurate as possible. The consultant worked closely with the production, reviewing scripts and set designs, offering technical notes on everything from the B-52 cockpit layout to the correct protocol for emergency communications. The problem? Nobody told him the film was a satire. He believed he was consulting on a serious dramatic production about the dangers of nuclear warfare. By the time he realized what Kubrick was actually making, filming was well underway. His technical contributions are part of why the film feels so unnervingly plausible. The cockpit of the B-52 looks authentic because it was designed with authentic input. Kubrick wanted the audience to believe in the world completely, so that when the absurdity hit, it hit like a ton of bricks. Using a real military advisor who took it seriously was, in retrospect, a stroke of genius. Number 7. There was a pie fight. It was filmed. Kubrick cut it. The film's original ending was not Slim Pickens riding a bomb into nuclear oblivion while We'll Meet Again plays over mushroom clouds. It was a massive pie fight in the war room. Kubrick filmed an extended sequence in which the tense standoff between American and Soviet officials in the war room dissolves into a full-scale custard pie battle. The scene reportedly featured dozens of pies, total chaos, and concluded with the Soviet ambassador smearing pie on President Muffley's face, prompting the president to declare, "Gentlemen, our beloved president has been struck down in his prime." Kubrick edited the scene, watched it back, and decided it was too farcical. It undermined the film's deeper satirical bite by turning everything into slapstick. He cut it entirely, replacing it with the nuclear detonation montage, which is haunting, funny, and terrifying all at once. The pie fight footage has never been officially released, though production stills from the sequence do exist. Number 8. The real Rand Corporation read the script and panicked. The Rand Corporation, the influential think tank that had been shaping American nuclear strategy since the early Cold War, got hold of Kubrick's script before production was complete. The reaction from some senior analysts was not amusement. It was alarm. Herman Kahn, one of Rand's most prominent nuclear strategists and one of the real-world inspirations for the character of Dr. Strangelove himself, reportedly found the script uncomfortably accurate in its depiction of how strategists actually thought about nuclear war. The film's satirical logic, that deterrence theory, taken to its extreme, produced insane conclusions. Was Kahn worried not far enough from the truth to be safely dismissed as fiction? Kahn later claimed that Strangelove had damaged serious public discourse about nuclear policy by making the entire field seem ridiculous. Kubrick's response in various interviews was essentially, if the shoe fits. The film wasn't mocking the strategists unfairly. It was holding a mirror up to logic that was, by any reasonable standard, genuinely mad. Number 9. Most of Dr. Strangelove's dialogue was improvised. Peter Sellers approached the role of Dr. Strangelove, the ex-Nazi scientist with the rogue mechanical arm, without a fully fixed characterization. He and Kubrick agreed that the character should emerge organically from the performances, and large sections of Strangelove's most memorable dialogue were improvised on set. The famous Mein Führer, I can walk line at the end of the film? Improvised. The arm that repeatedly defies Strangelove's attempts to control it, flying up in Nazi salutes against his will? Sellers developed that physical business himself during rehearsals, drawing on his background in physical comedy. Kubrick was famously demanding about takes. He would routinely shoot 30, 40, sometimes over 100 takes of a single scene. But with Sellers, he allowed an unusual degree of freedom, recognizing that the actor's instincts were producing gold. The Strangelove character is, as a result, a genuine co-creation between director and performer, evolving in real time across dozens of takes. Number 10. George C. Scott was tricked into his performance. George C. Scott was a deeply serious dramatic actor who later became famous for refusing his Oscar for Patton. He did not think of himself as a comedic performer. and he was deeply uncomfortable with the broad, almost cartoonish energy that Kubrick wanted for the character of General Buck Turgidson. Kubrick's solution was elegant and a little devious. He told Scott to give 2 versions of every scene, one played straight and seriously as Scott preferred, and one played in an exaggerated, over-the-top style as a kind of rehearsal warm-up. He assured Scott that the exaggerated takes were just for loosening up, and that he'd use the serious versions in the final film. He used the exaggerated takes. Every single one. Scott was reportedly furious when he saw the finished film and realized what Kubrick had done. He swore he would never work with Kubrick again. But the performance stands as one of the funniest and most precisely calibrated comic turns in American cinema. And Scott's genuine discomfort with the material gives Turgidson a manic, barely contained energy that no deliberately comic actor could have manufactured. Number 11. The film was delayed because of JFK's assassination. Dr. Strangelove was completed and ready for release in late 1963. Columbia Pictures had scheduled a December release date. Then, on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Columbia immediately pulled the film from its release schedule. A dark comedy about the accidental nuclear annihilation of the human race was not something any studio executive wanted to release into a nation in shock and mourning. The release was pushed back to January 1964, giving the country time to begin processing its grief. There was a second problem. A line of dialogue in the film that originally had Slim Pickens's character referring to a base called Burpelson, while mentioning that a fella could have a pretty good weekend in Dallas with all that stuff. The word Dallas was dubbed over with Vegas before release. The association was simply too raw. Number 12. One line accidentally revealed classified information. During production, the technical advisor and crew members working on the B-52 cockpit set accidentally made it too accurate. Specifically, certain instruments, procedures, and details about how the aircraft's systems actually worked were replicated with such fidelity that they crossed a line from dramatic realism into genuine security concern. The U.S. Air Force reviewed the production and flagged several elements. Kubrick and his team had to re-examine the cockpit set and alter specific details. Some dialogue was also reviewed for accuracy that went too far. Certain technical references to weapon systems procedures were modified before the film reached final cut. Kubrick took the notes seriously, not because he was legally obligated to, but because he didn't want the film's release jeopardized. The irony was perfect. A film designed to expose the absurdity of nuclear military thinking had gotten so deep into the research that it had accidentally bumped against the real thing. Number 13. Kubrick researched so deeply he became genuinely terrified. To prepare for Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick read over 50 books on nuclear warfare, strategy, and Cold War policy. He interviewed defense analysts, read declassified military documents, and immersed himself in the logic of mutual assured destruction to a degree that few filmmakers, or frankly, few people outside the actual defense establishment, had ever attempted. What he found genuinely frightened him. Not the dramatized fears that Hollywood had been selling since the 1950s, but something more unsettling. The realization that the people making decisions about nuclear weapons were operating on theories that sounded rational in academic papers but were, when examined closely, profoundly fragile. Small system failures, individual acts of irrationality, miscommunication under pressure. Any of these could, under the right conditions, trigger catastrophe. Kubrick said in interviews that he began the project expecting to make an anti-war film and ended it genuinely uncertain whether civilization was going to survive the century. That terror is embedded in every frame of Dr. Strangelove. The comedy isn't a way of making the fear smaller. It's a way of making it bearable. Number 14. The bomb-riding scene was inspired by a real military concept. The image of Slim Pickens straddling a nuclear warhead and riding it down like a rodeo bull is one of cinema's most indelible images. It looks like pure absurdist invention. It wasn't entirely. During his research, Kubrick discovered that early discussions within the military about bomb delivery methods had included conceptual work on manually guided or triggered devices, scenarios in which human proximity to the weapon was not entirely out of the question. The idea of a pilot essentially accompanying a bomb to its target, in some configurations, was not as far-fetched in the early nuclear era as it sounds today. Kubrick took that kernel of real strategic thinking, combined it with the persona of a Texas cowboy, and created something that worked simultaneously as slapstick, as political commentary, and as an image so perfectly composed that it has been analyzed in film schools ever since. The genius is that it's funny and horrifying at exactly the same moment. and the horror comes from the fact that the inspiration wasn't entirely fictional. Number 15. The cast members were kept deliberately separated. Kubrick made a deliberate production decision to keep certain cast members separated during filming, particularly those playing characters in different locations. The actors in the B-52 bomber sequences and the actors in the war room scenes largely did not interact during production, reinforcing the sense that these were genuinely parallel, disconnected worlds. This contributed to one of the film's most effective structural qualities. The three main locations, the war room, Burleson Air Force Base, and the B-52, feel like they exist in genuinely separate realities, each with their own logic, their own rhythm, their own version of madness. The intercut structure creates a mounting sense of dread because no one in any location fully understands what's happening in the others. Sellers, playing both Mandrake and Muffley, was of course present in two of those worlds, which added to the surreal quality of the production. But the deliberate separation of the ensemble helped preserve the film's tonal precision. Each world had to be internally consistent, even as the overall situation spiraled into absurdity. Number 16. Columbia Pictures tried to distance itself before release. As the release date approached, Columbia Pictures grew increasingly nervous about what they had. They had financed a Cold War satire that mocked the American military establishment, its officers, its president, and its nuclear policy. Released at the height of Cold War tensions, just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world genuinely close to nuclear war. Studio executives pushed for changes, softened marketing, and debated how to position the film to minimize controversy. There were internal discussions about whether to release it at all and in what markets, and with what kind of promotional framing. The studio was, in the language of modern Hollywood, deeply uncomfortable with its own product. The film was released anyway, largely because Kubrick's contract gave him significant creative and distribution control, unusual for the era, and the critics, almost universally, loved it. The audience came. The controversy the studio feared largely didn't materialize in the way they expected. Instead, Strangelove became recognized as a masterpiece, which is a more complicated and valuable problem for a studio to have than they realized at the time. Number 17. The film was effectively banned or restricted in several countries. While Dr. Strangelove was not officially banned outright in most markets, it faced significant distribution restrictions and delayed releases in a number of countries during the 1960s. In some regions, the film's satirical treatment of nuclear strategy was deemed too politically sensitive for wide release. Spain, under Franco's government, restricted the film significantly. Several other countries with close military alliances with the United States were cautious about wide theatrical distribution of a film that so directly mocked American military and political leadership. In some markets, the film was quietly given limited release, shown in art house theaters but not promoted to mainstream audiences. The Soviet Union, perhaps the most obvious market to wonder about, had a complicated relationship with the film. On one hand, the film was critical of American militarism. On the other, the Soviet ambassador characters, played for buffoonery, was not exactly a flattering portrait of Soviet dignity. The film's relationship with Cold War politics was appropriately too nuanced to be easily claimed by either side. Number 18. It lost all 4 Oscar nominations to My Fair Lady. Dr. Strangelove was nominated for 4 Academy Awards at the 1965 ceremony: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Actor for Peter Sellers. It lost every single one. The film that swept the night was My Fair Lady, a lavish, beloved musical adaptation that was, in almost every aesthetic and philosophical dimension, the opposite of Strangelove. My Fair Lady was warm, optimistic, impeccably crafted, and utterly unthreatening. Strangelove was cold, apocalyptic, and designed to make its audience profoundly uncomfortable about the state of the world. Film historians have revisited this particular Oscar night many times in the decades since. The consensus broadly is that Strangelove was the more significant and lasting work, that its influence on film, on political satire, on how cinema could engage with existential risk, far outpaced anything My Fair Lady produced. Kubrick himself never won a competitive Oscar. Dr. Strangelove is consistently listed among the primary reasons that fact seems, in retrospect, like one of the Academy's great oversights. Number 19. Dr. Strangelove appears for less than 20 minutes. The character who gives the film its title, Dr. Strangelove, the wheelchair-bound ex-Nazi scientist with the rogue arm, appears on screen for less than 20 minutes of the film's 95-minute runtime. By some counts, it's closer to 15. This is one of cinema's great sleights of hand. Strangelove is so vivid, so precisely drawn, so impossible to forget that viewers routinely overestimate how much screen time he actually occupies. The character dominates the film's memory disproportionately to his actual presence, which is itself a kind of comment on how charismatic extremism works. Sellers understood this intuitively. He didn't play Strangelove as a character who needed screen time to make an impression. He played him as someone who had been compressed under enormous psychological pressure into something that could explode at any moment. Every scene with Strangelove feels like it's building toward a revelation. The final scene, when he rises from his wheelchair, is one of cinema's great payoffs. And it lands because Sellers spent the entire rest of the film coiling the spring. Number 20. The film influenced real US nuclear policy. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact on this list, and it is thoroughly documented. In the wake of Dr. Strangelove's release and the broader public discourse it ignited, the United States Department of Defense undertook a serious review of its nuclear command and control protocols. The film had dramatized, with uncomfortable accuracy, the ways in which nuclear authority could be circumvented by a single, determined, or deranged individual. The two-man rule for nuclear authorization, while it existed in some form before the film, was strengthened and more rigorously enforced in the years following Strangelove's release. Communication protocols between civilian leadership and military command were also reviewed and reinforced. Defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who later became famous for leaking the Pentagon Papers, confirmed in interviews that Strangelove had captured something real about the vulnerabilities in nuclear command structure, and that the film had contributed to internal pressure for reform. A satirical comedy made by a British director working in England had meaningfully influenced the nuclear policy of the world's most powerful military. Kubrick had set out to hold a mirror up to madness. The madness blinked first. Number 21. Kubrick kept the master print hidden in his home for decades. Stanley Kubrick was famously protective of his films. After completing a picture, he retained extraordinary control over the prints, the negatives, and the distribution materials, to a degree that was highly unusual for a director working with major studios. With Dr. Strangelove, this protectiveness extended to the master print itself. Kubrick kept materials from his films, including Strangelove, at his estate in Hertfordshire, England, where he lived and worked for the final decades of his life. After his death in 1999, the full extent of what he had preserved became apparent. Warehouses and rooms filled with production materials, scripts, correspondence, prints, and archival materials from across his entire career. The Kubrick Archive, now housed at the University of the Arts London, contains an extraordinary collection of materials from Dr. Strangelove, including original annotated scripts, production photographs, correspondence with advisors and studios, and research materials that document the incredible depth of preparation that went into the film. What Kubrick kept wasn't just memorabilia. It was evidence of how seriously he took the responsibility of making a film about the most serious subject in human history. 60 years after its release, Dr. Strangelove is not a museum piece. It's a live wire. The questions it asks about who controls the weapons, about the logic of deterrence, about whether the people making the biggest decisions are actually sane, have not gotten less urgent. If anything, they've gotten more urgent. Kubrick made a film that was supposed to be fiction. What he actually made was a document of how the world works when the stakes are absolute and the humans involved are still just humans. Every one of the facts in this video points to the same conclusion. Dr. Strangelove wasn't just a great film, it was a warning. And we're still living in the world it was warning us about. If this video gave you something to think about, hit subscribe. We dig into the stories behind the films that shaped how we see the world. Drop a comment below. Which of these facts surprised you the most? We'll see you in the next one.